but it will be of different topics and also with different instructors. So this is technically my last workshop for Build On. You can also check out more details on, as what Valerie said, buildonasean2021.com over here, right? Okay, so this workshop is slightly different compared to our previous workshops because this workshop will be just 1 hour, right? So, but we do have a little bit of content to cover, but we'll try to fit it in that hour, right? So just like yesterday, I would need you guys to download Node.js, but if you already have that Node.js installed, no worries. That means you're fine. And also Insomnia over here. Insomnia. So you can choose either Insomnia or Postman, postman.com. Okay, you can use this as well. They both serve roughly the same purpose. Okay, but of course, for the purposes of this workshop today, we are going to use Insomnia. All right, so let's get started. So in the last workshop, we talked about what servers are, right? We basically build servers. Then we develop a Node Express server. We use Express to build a server on top of Node, and how the combination of 4 methods and the path, right, basically creates individual endpoints that serves to accomplish different things. Okay, so get being the endpoint that you want to retrieve items, post being the endpoint that you want to being the method, sorry, that you want to sort of like create new entries, and put for updating, right? Updating existing entries, and delete, obviously, to delete items, right? So the combination of the methods and the path will basically be defining enough to see what are you going to do to this resource. Are you going to create new ones? Are you just going to read? Are you going to update? Are you going to delete? Okay. So obviously, you don't have any sort of like persistent storage. You don't have any sort of like resource that you can update for now, because what we ended off with the last workshop is basically you just creating the endpoints, but it doesn't do anything yet. You are just reading the data from the request, and then you're just replying it back. Okay, so today we're going to do something about persistent storage, or another name for it is called databases. Okay. So AWS offers multiple database services like AWS RDS, Aurora, and DynamoDB. Okay, so each different sort of like types of services, database services, they all have their own characteristics depending on your requirement and all that. You kind of have to make a choice between which service you want. Okay, but of course for beginners, DynamoDB is one of the most accessible one, because usually you just want sort of like, I want a table that has rows of data for me to store. Okay, usually that's the use case, and that covers a good 99% of your use cases. All right. So today we're going to use DynamoDB on AWS to basically store our persistent data, and then be able to configure our application to be able to read from these databases, and also be able to send that data back to whoever's requesting it. Okay. So now I'm going to go back to our AWS Educate site over here. You can access this via awseducate.com. Okay, you can visit this website via this link over here. All right. So once you're on this page, don't worry if you don't have your Educate account yet. Just make sure you get up to speed with Valerie. All right. So she already mentioned all the methods that you can use to reach her. All right. So now we're going to click on the sign in to AWS Educate button over here, and I'm going to log into my accounts. Just to check, am I sharing the screen? Okay, I am. All right, so over here we have a couple of buttons over here. All right, but what I want you guys to do is go to My Classrooms. All right. So I'm enrolled with multiple classes, but don't worry, for you guys, if your account is new and you just sign up for this, you should probably only have one. Okay, so for mine, I have a couple, but I remember the one that we did last workshop, where we deploy our Elastic Beanstalk application. Okay, so that was on the third one, if I remember correctly. So I'm going to click on go to classroom and go to continue. So the idea here is that you must go to your Vocarium site over here, and then here is where you access your AWS console and some account details. So in our last few workshops, we basically talked about just ignoring this account details button, but today we're going to actually make use of this thing, okay? But for now, let's go to AWS console first, because we first need to go to our DynamoDB console, all right? So I'm going to click on AWS console, and the same, we're going to make sure that you show the blocked pop-up window on Safari, because Safari blocks pop-ups. Going to join hackathon, how do I access? Yeah, that one you have to yeah, Valerie, can you answer Roshan's question? Yeah, thank you. Yes, so this is your AWS Management Console, all right? So the first thing that you need to do over here is to access your DynamoDB, okay? So when you deploy your Elastic Beanstalk application, your Node Express application, you will use Elastic Beanstalk instead. When you deploy your static website, your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, you will use S3. And then now we are going to create a DynamoDB table. Obviously, we have to go to DynamoDB over here, okay? So usually the idea of a table is something like this. You have a class, right? You have a class, and then you need a table to store your all of the students in your class. Usually that constitutes a table, okay? So when you build an application, sometimes you create one, sometimes you create two, sometimes you create multiple tables. There's no real sort of like say, oh, one application should have one table. It doesn't have to be that way. It really depends on your data structures, how many things are you going to store, like what are the data types that you have, right? How is it organized, okay? Obviously right now, for my example just now, I was talking about your class list, right? If you're talking about class list, each student will be an entry in a table. That table will be your class list, something like that, okay? So if you're on this screen, this is where you need to be. I'm gonna zoom in a little bit, all right? So at first you won't be able to see the options on the left-hand side, okay? So I urge you guys to please click on this chevron over here. Click on this, and you should see a couple of buttons here, okay? So don't worry about all these options. The only thing that you need to pay attention to is probably tables, okay? Just click on that, and you should arrive on this screen. So if you have tables, this is where you see all the tables, obviously, right? So what I'm going to do over here is to create a single table. Click on Create Table, and then you have to label your table. So remember, when you deploy your S3 website and everything, you have to make sure that it's unique across the region and everything. Over here, you don't have to. Okay, it's because it needs to be unique within your account. That's all. All right, so let's do that. So what I'm going to do is probably I'm going to call this HR employee list. Right, remember we have like a HR app that we built last week. Last workshop, where we were trying to emulate some sort of like a HR app. Okay, so it makes sense for us to create a table for HR employee list. And then after that, we have primary key. What is this primary key? What is partition key and all that? So imagine you have a list, okay? A student list per se, all right? Let's say. Each row will be your students, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, until like let's say 40 students in a class. So what is the main sort of like data that uniquely identifies each student in that particular class? Okay, what is that that particular data? Let's say we use their name. All right, let's say my name is Eric Tai, right? So that works fine if I don't have another second Eric Tai in the same class. But in the event that I sort of I have another like transfer student coming in, and then his name is also Eric Tai, then what? I am no longer unique, something like that. Then if If your list has this list of students, suddenly you have two Eric guys over there. And then when they sort of like refer to, hey, I call Eric guy, then suddenly two guys starts to stand up and, hey, answer the guy, answer the call. So that's bad, all right? So we want to be able to have a single sort of like column that is able to uniquely identify every single entry in that table. So usually that equals to something like your identification number. Okay, that's unique enough. Or maybe your passport number, or maybe your matriculation number. Let's say you're a university, or maybe your employee ID. Okay, so the word ID over here is a very common word or common term that they use to uniquely identify every single row. So that's what partition key is for. The partition key is basically what is that particular field that every single row is unique. Okay, so usually we will do something like maybe employee ID, or you can just write ID. That works as well, because obviously there's only one single column with ID. Okay, so and as ID goes, usually you will try to stick strings, okay, because we are going to use some sort of like a library for us to generate these ID strings, because I'm not going to write 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then the next one, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so that's horrible. So what we're going to do is we're going to do something like this website over here. This website over here. So each time I refresh, I get a long string like this. Okay, so each time I refresh, I get a long string. Just now it's 5FD. If I refresh, it's B28, blah, 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 right? So as you can see, this gets basically gets randomized, and then you probably won't get any sort of like chance for this thing to collide. But of course, given if your app runs for like maybe, I don't know, 20, 30 years, and then your database becomes bigger and bigger, maybe there's a chance for them to clash once in a while. Okay, but don't worry about that. Okay, so we're going to do something like that later. So for now, we're going to come back here and set this to ID. Make sure this is on string, and that's it. There are no other options that you need to toggle anymore. All right. So sort key. Sort key is something like the second key in combination of the partition key that makes it unique. All right. So let's say my example, first name and last name. My first name was Eric, and then my last name is Pai, right? So Eric, given the first name, probably not unique enough, but combining with the last name, you're probably unique enough, right? So in the events that you need to do some sort of like this composite keys, right? Combination of two keys, that's what makes you unique enough, then you will do so. But for starters, for beginners, please try not to touch this, okay? Please stick with one single key. So I'm going to click on create over here, and then the creation process is pretty simple, okay? And that's it, okay? So you have a table called HR employee list, and obviously there are no items going on here. So the idea here is that we need to be able to develop while connected to the database, right? So obviously your computer needs to be connected to the internet, and after that, when you build your application, you'll be able to send requests to this table, maybe like create new entries, read entries, and all that, all the usual 4 operations: create, read, update, and delete. Okay, the common term for this is CRUD. Okay, so it's pretty common if you see like online when you search for CRUD application using blah blah blah. So this is quite a common term. Okay, so to do this, we are going to go back to our Visual Studio Code, and then I'm going to open our previous application. Remember the Node.js application? Open, and we're going to go back to our HR app. That was what we were working with last workshop. All right, so I'm going to click on that, and this is where we left off. Right, so we have all these endpoints. Right, one that's job is basically to read, and then the next one is to create, next one is to update, and then the last one is to delete. Okay, I'll try to cover all 4 of them, but given the time constraints, I'll see how fast we go. Okay. So the idea here is that when you want to connect to your database over here, right, you need a couple of sort of like tools to get together. Okay, first we need to use a library called Dynamos. Okay, Dynamos. All right. So this library over here is a modeling tool for Amazon's DynamoDB. Okay, it makes it very easy for you to work with DynamoDB via very interactive, very intuitive APIs. Okay, when you want to create, it's just create. When you want to update, it's just update. Okay, so it's pretty clear cut in that sense. So in order for you to install this, what you have to do is you have to go back to your application here and open your terminal. Okay, so for example, let me see if I don't have this terminal. Click on the terminal option over here on your navigation bar. Depending on if you're Windows or if you're Mac, you should be roughly at the same location. And then I'm going to click on New Terminal. Okay. So you have a terminal that's basically that's configured for this particular folder here. Okay, so if you do the steps according to what I'm basically guiding you guys to, you should have a terminal that works for this folder. All right. So the next thing that you need to do is we're going to install this library called Dynamos. Okay, so if you look at it, the documentations, all they're asking you is to install Dynamos. Okay, npm install Dynamos. Okay, let's do that. npm install Dynamos. Right. So we did this with Express before, right? But today we're going to install an additional library called Dynamos. So we're going to install that, let that run. All right, so don't worry about the warnings and everything. This doesn't matter. This doesn't relate to you. So just all we need is to double confirm on your package.json and see if there's new entry, okay, that says Dynamos. Okay, version number doesn't really matter to you. What we need to make sure is we need to make sure that we have Express and Dynamos, and that's all. Okay. The next thing that we need to do is Dynamos needs to be authenticated in order to connect to your DynamoDB, and that DynamoDB lives on the cloud, all right? So there needs to be some sort of like a layer of authentication. So depending on how your AWS account is set up, you need a couple of keys, right? And in the event of like us using AWS Educate accounts, I want you guys to go back to your Vocarium page over here. Okay, remember when you guys try to access your console, you have to touch this, you have to click on this AWS console button. But for us to get those credentials so that we can access those DynamoDB tables programmatically, right, via code, what we want to do is I want you guys to click on account details over here. Okay. So even though this session is recorded and me sharing the keys and all that, I don't need to worry about this, because if I click on show all these keys and everything, these are like my secret keys. Okay, if I have these keys, I can access my resources on my AWS accounts or AWS Educate account. But of course, my AWS Educate session over here, this current login session, only works for 3 hours. Okay, so as I've logged in for like maybe 15 minutes now, 25 minutes now, I only have 2 hours, 35 minutes to go, right? So even though if I link these credentials or maybe the video recording gets uploaded and then people try to copy my credentials over here, it wouldn't work, okay? So don't worry about that. So all we need is all these credentials over here. So we're gonna leave this here. What we're going to do is we'll come back to our code here. And I want you guys to create a new file called .env. So I'm going to do that step over here, .env. Okay, .env. So what is this .env for? Usually when you're developing with like services that requires authentication, then you need keys, you need secret keys, you need like, special access keys and all that. You will need to store it in a file, okay, like this, using .env, okay, and then use other means for you to import those keys into your code, all right? Because why? Usually you don't want to upload all these keys because it's dangerous for other people to be able to see your keys, because if they have access to your keys, they have access to whatever services these keys are for, because they basically don't know who is using those keys. So long you have the keys, you are that person, so-called, right? So it's just like you are giving your keys, your house keys to someone else. And then obviously whoever has your house keys, they can come into your house and open your doors and everything, okay? So this is quite crucial. So what we're going to do is we're going to come into our .env file and copy all these things. Please exclude the default section. You notice how there's a square bracket default over here. Please exclude that. We don't want to copy that. Copy everything else but the default section over here. So copy that, and we're going to come back to our .env and paste it. Okay? Should be quite straightforward. The next thing that I want you to do is we're going to capitalize every single key over here. You notice how there's a pattern here. AWS access key ID equals to da da da. All right. This is a key. All right. This is like the label of the key. So we need to do this thing where we capitalize this particular string over here. So what I'll do is I'll probably share this later. But I have some sort of shortcut that allows me to do that. I'll share it later. All right. So there are three keys here: AWS access key ID, AWS secret access key, AWS session token. Okay. I'll share this with everyone. AWS secret access key. Access key, secret access key, and then we have our session token. Okay, the three strings over here. So if you find it very difficult for you to change it to uppercase, don't worry, you can copy from the Zoom chat as well. Okay, so you don't have to put them in quotation marks and everything. Just paste them, and it should be fine. Okay. All right, so that this en.env file over here will be sort of like our credential for us to communicate with our DynamoDB service. So I want you guys to save this file, and then we're going to configure our code to be able to read this particular .env. So out of the box, here are a couple of steps that we need to do. When you require, let's say this step over here, constant dynamos, because after we install, obviously we need to use dynamos. So when we try to import dynamos, right, the moment you import dynamos, they will try to read the credentials. Okay, so how do they read the credentials? They will read from your .env, or they will read from your process environment, not exactly .env. They will read from your process environment. So obviously you need to be able to have those credentials ready, okay? So before you import this dynamos, you have to do one more step for us to configure the step where we read from the .env files. So in order to do that, we need another library, npm install .env, okay? Now the spelling is slightly different, yeah, .env. npm install install.env, right? So once we install this, make sure we do the code that we basically place the code that I'm doing over here at the top of your file, because why? We want those keys to be loaded immediately. All right. So let's do that. So constant.env is equals to require.env. Okay, and then the next thing we should do is .env.config. That's it. All right. The two lines will ensure that after you have imported .env, it will configure so that it will read the file over here and populate the credentials, your current environment with these credentials. So after that, the line, when line 4 executes, when it tries to import dynamos, you would have immediately tried to read the credentials, which is now already populated by .env. Okay, so please make sure you do this in this order. Yeah, you first require .env and .env config, then only you require dynamos. Because if you do it the other way around, let's say over here, this wouldn't work. Dynamos wouldn't know your credentials. Okay, so make sure you do it. Do your .env config stuff before your dynamos imports. Okay. All right. After that, we need to do the next step where we need to set the region, okay? Because why? AWS accounts are actually available on many regions, okay? So obviously right now we are on AWS Educate accounts. You guys are locked to a single region, which is North Virginia over here. You can see on the top right corner. When you create your tables over your DynamoDB tables, they only exist in that particular region. Okay, so you need to be able to specify, hey, where is this table located at, right? Is this region or that region? In this case, if we are using AWS Educate account, we are locked at a single region, which is North Virginia. So I want you guys to click on this drop down. You should be able to see North Virginia with the shortcut that says sort of like an acronym, US-East 1. Okay, the code is US-East 1. All right. So if you're in Singapore and you're developing on your own account, right, or your company's account, and you probably want to have your databases close to you, you probably use the AP Southeast 1, right? So really depending on where you're developing, where is your audience actually, right? So I want you guys to come back here. We're going to do quite a bit of code, so please bear with me. dynamos.aws.sdk.config.updates region US East 1. Okay. Again, I'll try to copy this because this is quite a mouthful. Okay. dynamos.aws.sdk.config.update. Right. Then you put in an object of a single key region US East 1. You must have this particular clause. If you don't have this, Dynamos does not know where to find your table. Right. Save this thing, and then after that, we are going to do the next step where we need to define something called schema. Right. So as a table, right? As a table over here. Yeah, Vincent, I'll share you guys my GitHub profile. So watch out for that. And then I'll upload my projects up there. Okay. In fact, let me do it now. GitHub. Yep. Oops. My account. My profile. Yes, this one. Okay, so please watch out for projects that I'm going to upload. All right, so what is schema for in the context of Dynamos? So whenever you're dealing with databases, right, traditional databases requires you to say, hey, your table must have this few columns in that particular format. But DynamoDB is kind of like, unopinionated, as in the sense that they don't really care what you upload. So long when you upload, when you update your stuff, and then they will just store it, right? Sometimes you don't want that kind of behavior, right? If you want sort of like consistency in your code, and be able to say, hey, my table is only going to contain a couple of fields. Let's say my name, my age, and address, and that's all. So if you want all these fields and you want them to be predefined at a very early stage, we're all going to use something called schema. So the way to configure this is we're going to create an object called schema. Constant schema is equals to new dynamos.schema. This new keyword is something related to your OOP. Remember your Python, beginning Python workshops? So there's a session, I think it's in the 5th workshop. So they were talking about OOP over there, object-oriented programming. So over here, you put in your object where you need to configure the schema, okay? So the very first item in your object, I know object doesn't means unordered collection, but here is required for you to put the very first key in your object as the partition key. Make sure your partition key, click on overview. Where's the partition key here? ID. Make sure that it matches with this, the very first key here, okay? And then after that, I'm going to say, what is this format? String, all right? So after that, we are going to do something like, let's say we're going to complement our front-end application. We're going to do something like, let's say your name. I will need your name to store in my HR table. And then what else? I will need your age, let's say. So how do you store age? Maybe I'll use number, okay? And then I'll probably store your address as well, address. And to store address, let's say address, we have the unit number and then we have the building name. So how do we define that in terms of schema? In order to do so, we have to define types, objects, and objects and schema. Then the contents of this address object. So unit number, this unit number should probably be string as well. My building name should still be string, okay? And then after that, I'll probably do another example. Let's say past education. What's your type? This type will be an array. What's the schema? This schema will be an array of string. That's it, okay? So over here, I'm basically trying to say address will be an object of two items, unit and building name, unit number and building name. What's a past education? It will be an array. Array of what? Array of strings, okay? So past education, I think we can use arrays because, I mean, past education should be in like chronological order. What's your high school, then what's your uni, what's your like postgrad or something like that, okay? After that, the next one thing that I need to do is to actually create a reference to the table. So constant HR equals to dynamos.model. Here is where you pass in your table name. What is your table name? You're going to come back here and say HR employee list. Okay, copy that. Come back here and paste this, right? And then after that, we are going to pass in the schema that we just created, schema. So that's it, right? So HR will be the reference that you can use to interact with the table itself. It's quite a bit of like prep work. You have to do your env, put in your credentials, and then you come in here, you set your .env, set your region, create your schema, and then create a reference to that table, okay? So HR is what we need over here. So now what are we going to do? Obviously right now, if you look at our table, it's empty, okay? And if it's empty, should I go and create start writing the API so that I can start reading from an empty table? I mean, if I were to read an empty table, I'm probably not going to get any interesting sort of like feedback. So why not let me go and write something that allows me to create items, okay? So we have something of this structure, which is just going to reply with whatever you sent. So I'm going to build on top of this. So you are going to send something like this. Let me go to my insomnia. Where is my 2021 short? Yeah, you're supposed to send something like this. Post, okay? You're supposed to send this structure over here, okay? I'm going to remove all this and first I'm going to send in name. What's my name? Eric. And then we have your age, which is 31. And then address, which is an object of two keys, unit number, D47, building name, Upper East, and past education. All right, very simple one. St. Michael's Institution and Nanyang. Second entry, Nanyang Technological University. Right? Oh, what's going on here? Oh, I forgot to put as quotation marks here. Past education as well. Okay, should be fine. All right. So I'm supposed to send this request to post locals 3000, all right, which is this particular endpoint over here. So I'm supposed to get the data, which is inside request.body because of what we set up last workshop. Now, what I'm supposed to do here is I'm going to use hr.create, okay? HR, obviously, being the reference to the table, create allows us to create new entries, okay? So what is this create new entry supposed to do? It's supposed to receive, obviously, the data itself. Now, the problem here is this. Notice how I fill up the whole object and then I have name, age, address, past education by missed out ID. This is a very common pattern. When you send your request, let's say from a front-end application, from your user or whatever, you don't rely on them to create the ID. You, as a backend developer who creates the backend application, should be the one creating the ID instead. So how do we do that? So first of all, I'm going to use this library called UUID. Install UUID, okay? So quite a bit of libraries that we're installing over here. Okay, so we're going to do the same thing, import your UUID, supposed to require UUID. UUID is a library that allows us to just create random strings according to a certain format. Which format? Remember this page over here, this format, right? So we're going to follow this particular format. So in order to do so, we are going to come down here and now create the final object. So we have your new object. ID will be your UUID.v4. So why am I choosing v4? Because v4, this is quite advanced. Essentially, what this v1, v2, v3, v4 is basically how they randomize your IDs. Okay, like what are they using to inject into your randomized ID? So type 1 uses MAC address and date time, type 2 uses MD5 hash and all that. So it really doesn't matter. v4 is the most common one that they use. Okay, so we're going to stick with v4. And then after that, we're going to spread the rest of our payload, okay, which is coming from the request, all right? Once we have that, I'm going to remove all this. Once we have that, this is actually what we call sort of like a data type called promise. Long story short, promises is basically just something like when you send another resource to do something, it takes a while for them to come back and tell you, oh, I'm done, right? Because why? The database is in a separate computer. It's in a network. You probably need like a good maybe 2 seconds for them to reply to you whether it's completed or not, right? So with that in mind, you can't exactly say, oh, go and create. And after that, the next thing you do is straight away go and reply back, right? So you have to do something that involves using .then over here. .then allows us to write code in such a way that, hey, go and create first. And then when you're done, then you do the following actions, okay? So in that way, we basically allows us to queue the actions in such a way that after this thing is done, then you have the next step, all right? You can write your steps like this, okay? So we're gonna create your arrow functions here again. And here is where you get the final data, because what is this data coming from? After this thing has finished creating your, HR has finished creating your entry, it will come back with some sort of new data. What is that new data? If it comes back with this particular chunk of data, that means the entry is successful, okay? So they managed to create new one. So what we're going to do here is we're going to just send the response back, okay? Send the data back in JSON form, all right? If the front end guy receives the whole chunk back, that means this thing is successful, okay? Now, there's also a way for you to write code in such a way that what happens if the network call fails, right? Because there's just so many layers in between. Like let's say on your side, if you want to communicate with the DynamoDB database, how would you ensure that there's nothing going to happen in between? Sometimes your internet connection might be wonky. Sometimes maybe DynamoDB goes down, right? You never know what happens in between. Or maybe sometimes the user is who's trying to communicate with the database, and then while it's loading, then internet connection will cut off or something like that, right? So what are you supposed to do? .catch allows us to basically handle that particular situation. So I'm going to just send the error because you're going to get some sort of an error what I'm going to do is I'm just going to send the error back. All right, and that's it. This whole chunk over here allows us to create an entry based on whoever sent the request. Okay, the payload. What is this payload? This chunk over here. Okay, so please make sure that this chunk of data is supposed to follow this particular schema, because if it doesn't follow this schema, it will just not, it just wouldn't save. Okay, they will come and tell you something wrong. They're not matching the schema. Okay. The next step is we've basically coded in such a way that after this thing is done, then only you reply with the JSON data, okay? Because if you don't do so, you won't be able to wait for this thing to come back, right? So I'm going to do save this thing, and then let me start the application. npm run starts. Right? Come back over here and hit send. All right, so I received some data back. All right, you notice how this ID is not written by me, right? I didn't write this ID manually. Where is this ID coming from? UUID v4. Okay, that's how I created a new object with an additional field ID and the rest of the payload. Okay, now if you go back to your table, click on refresh button over here. You should see a new entry here that has all the information that you need. Okay, which is whatever that you just sent, all right? So if I go back here and then if I just keep on send and then just send a couple more, you can see how it takes like maybe a good 1.5 seconds to come back to me, okay? So I basically send maybe like 4 to 5. So I come back here and refresh. There you go, you have all 5 data and each entry has different ID. This is what this UUID is doing for us. It allows us to create this particular value for that field so that it remains unique all the time, okay? Now, the next thing I want to do is I want to, let me just create one more before we actually deploy this application. Right, so in order to read, you will have to use scan. Scan allows us to read everything, okay? .exec is, the way this works is that it's a long command, but since we're just doing scan, exec will just cut this thing off, and then we can continue writing our usual .den stuff, all right? So you have the data. I'll try to just copy paste all these things because we are running out of time. Yeah. So essentially, we're doing exactly the same thing. Read everything. If the reply comes back, then I'll send the reply back. If there's any error, send the error back. Okay. Save this thing. Obviously, restart the server. Forgot to do that. And come back to test on get. Okay, make sure it's get. I'm going to hit send. Okay, you can see all this data coming back, right? And if you collapse them, right, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, there are 5 entries here. Okay, so that's basically how you develop locally. Now, if I were to give you a hint, I'll probably just tell you what is this put going to use. We're going to use hr.updates. Let me check. hr.update. Yes, correct. Okay. hr.updates. And the next one is hr.delete. Okay. So I'll complete this and upload it to my GitHub so that you guys can check out what how do you actually implement this. But the idea here should be exactly the same as how you would do create and scan over here. It's exactly the same. No, not much changes. Okay. All right. So we have this application and we want to deploy. Okay. To deploy this application, we need to do a couple of things. Remember, we already have an Elastic Beanstalk instance running. So all we need to do is just come back to Elastic Beanstalk. Okay, and we want to deploy our application, the application that we have just updated, right? So the way to do this is I'm just going to click on this this application that we deployed yesterday, and then we are supposed to update it using this button here. This button allows us to upload new versions of the app, right? So I'm going to click on this and I have to choose a file, obviously. Where is the file? I don't have the file yet. I'm going to come back to our application, right click and go to reveal it using your File Explorer or Finder. So I'm going to click on that. And this is what you should be looking at. Okay. This is very important. You notice how I have 4 files, 3 files in one folder: app.js, node modules, package log, package.json. And while on your Visual Studio Code, you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are 5. What about .env? .env, because of the leading dots in the front at the front of the file name, it is called a hidden file. All right. So usually your operating system wouldn't show that particular file for you because it's hidden. So, and that's good, because why? When you upload your application over there, right, to Elastic Beanstalk, we don't want these credentials anymore, because these credentials are only valid for 3 hours and probably counting down for like 2 hours now. And obviously we want our application to live longer than 2 hours, right? So we don't want to use these credentials anymore. We want to use another way to write permissions so that your Elastic Beanstalk can access your DynamoDB database, right? So that's good. In order for those who are curious, for us to show the hidden files, if you're on Mac, it's Command-Shift-Dots. But if you're on Windows, I believe you have to fiddle with some of the settings at the top, okay? I don't really use Windows, so I don't really know where are the settings, okay? So we are not going to use .env, just leave it there. I don't want the .env file. Highlight everything and compress. We're going to create a zip file, okay? Or if you're on Windows, same thing, is something like share to or send to, and then into a compress or zip folder, okay? Now I'm going to now deploy this application, click on choose file, and I'm supposed to drag this file here. Okay, upload. Okay, hit deploy. So they will take their time to upload this application over here and then deploy. Now, this is very important. When you first deploy your application, it takes quite a while, because that's when they start to provision, all these resources, and that takes quite a while. But when after subsequent deployments, after that, when you update your application, it should really take probably good 30 seconds or a minute, and that's all. Okay. All right. While we're waiting for this, let me go to configuration, because we need to set some of the permission stuff. All right. What I want you to do is scroll down, click on configuration, scroll down to security, okay? On the security section, click on edit. There's service role and IAM instance profile over here, okay? So the difference between these two roles, these are basically permissions. What is service role? Service role is for Elastic Beanstalk. What can Elastic Beanstalk do? But when we write permissions for Elastic Beanstalk over here to access our DynamoDB, who is the one actually accessing the DynamoDB? Not Elastic Beanstalk. It is the little EC2 instances that Elastic Beanstalk controls. So Elastic Beanstalk here is the manager or the orchestrator to control all these EC2 instances. But who's actually making the connection to DynamoDB? The EC2 instances. So what I want to pay no attention to over here is IAM instance profile, AWS Elastic Beanstalk EC2 role over here. This is the one that we need to update the permissions so that this role, EC2, can access the DynamoDB, okay? So in order to do so, you have to click on your services or this search bar over here. We're going to look for IAM. Okay, and then we're going to see this service over here called IAM, Manage Access to AWS Resources. IAM stands for Identity and Access Management. Look for a while. Okay, don't worry about the error. It's just doesn't affect our workflow. So there are a couple of options over here. Usually for you, you will only touch roles and policies, okay, if you're dealing with educate accounts. If you're not, if this is your own account, you will touch all these options over here, probably 1 to the first 5, user groups, users, roles, policies, and identity providers. Usually these few are quite often, okay? But for our purposes today, this workshop, we're going to touch only roles, okay? So what is roles? What is policies? Roles is basically a group of policies, right? So under a single name. As you can see, there are a couple of roles over here. What we need to change is AWS Elastic Beanstalk EC2 role, not the service role. Service role is for Elastic Beanstalk itself. EC2 role is for the EC2, little EC2 instances. We're going to click on this. Don't worry about error. Again, don't worry about error. So there are a couple of like predefined permissions already, but none of them define that you can access DynamoDB. So what we're going to do is I'm going to click on attach policies. And I'm going to search for DynamoDB. Okay. So notice how there's an option that says DynamoDB full access. Okay. Please make sure you select that and then click on attach policy. And that's it, right? So now this particular role has all these permissions. You can fully access DynamoDB. You can do anything you want with DynamoDB. But of course, in the real production world, you're not supposed to do this. You're supposed to limit the permissions to the point where you can only access this table, right? Who can access this table? This particular EC2 can access this table. Because if you don't do so, if your code leaks out or whatever, or there's something wrong going on with your application, maybe you accidentally create a new table. Maybe you accidentally change another table, right? So you never know what's wrong with your code. But for starters right now, I think it's fine, especially this is a sandbox environment. It's good to experiment, but pay attention to this because in the future, you need to not do this. You have to create your own policy, okay? Now I'm gonna go back to Elastic Beanstalk. Let's see if that the application got deployed properly. All right. And then now we're going to click on this. 400, you'll be not healthy. What is that? So let's see. Copy this link over here. I'm going to go to Insomnia. I'm going to test this particular call, all right? Production. Copy, paste. Most likely you need to refresh because of restart app server. Yeah. So just now when you apply your new permissions, most likely because of that, you probably have to restart your server so that you can adopt the new permissions, right? And then after that, you should be able to, you should be able to retrieve your, what's going on here? Yeah, okay, now it's done. So yeah, don't be alarmed if this health turns severe or anything. Sometimes they get panic and then they immediately report it's not working, but actually the instances are not running yet. Okay, so don't get panic. Don't panic if you see this health severe over here. Make sure you try the application. If you manage to get the data, that means it's already working. Okay. So yeah, this is you deploying the application, how you set the permissions, and finally coding your application to communicate with DynamoDB, set the permissions for your Elastic Beanstalk, and finally deploying your application to Elastic Beanstalk so that you can now have a functioning application that sits on the cloud that can access the DynamoDB table. All right. So the next thing that you need to do is you probably want to, we don't really have enough time to cover, you probably want to make your front-end application, the one who's coding HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to be able to access this API over here. I mean, you've created all this fancy API and everything. How are you going to access this, right, from the front end, right? In order to do so, you have to use fetch, okay? The idea here is roughly the same. You notice how we are using the .den again. So it's roughly the same. So if you make sure you pass in the URL for this particular fetch API over here, and then you set den. First you get response, you change response to JSON, then you chain it with the next den, then finally you have the data, okay? So all the documentations are on this page. This page should suffice for you to do all the 4 steps. The idea here is that you need to be able to get, post, put, and delete. Right. So yes, that's about it. One more thing that you need to pay attention is, I forgot to do this just now. Make sure you install another library called course. I'll explain to you what this does in a bit. Course. This is an old school security, something like that. Because why? Usually websites are not, they only allow their own sort of like website that's hosted by the same server to access the server. And right now, since our website is separate, we have to do one more setting to disable the course, disable this particular security settings on your server so that you can let everyone make a call to this particular server. But that's fine, right? Because only you know your URL, for at least for now, okay? So idea here is you must import course, require course, sorry, not port, course. And then what you do is, you notice how you have app.use express.json, just do it exactly the same, app.use course execute, that's all. So this particular setting will unlock that particular security setting, because if you don't have this, your front end, your HTML, CSS, JavaScript won't be able to call this particular API, okay? So make sure you have this before you deploy it, okay? I kind of forgot to do this just now. All right, other than that, everything should be as one. I just covered, okay? Yeah, with that, I'm gonna pass the time back to Valerie.
Just share my screen.